Welcome to This Is Fine, where we take a balanced look at the terrible dumpster fire that is tech and cybersecurity. I'm your host, Matt Treiner, the CEO of Hunter Strategy, here to dive into the intricacies of node modules and NPM with some tech experts from Hunter. Matt DiVertola, Senior DevOps Engineer, Greg Venor, Director of Software Engineering, and Jeff Siegel, our Chief Technology Officer. NPM, the Node Package Manager, has completely transformed how we develop and deploy JavaScript applications. It's a tool that has both driven innovation and at times given rise to some of the most baffling and meme-worthy open source projects. Today, we're diving into its broader impact, its benefits, and potential pitfalls it presents, especially in the context of government and enterprise software development. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So, just to start off on a semi-serious note, Greg, can you give us like a 30 seconds on if anybody's actually listening to this and doesn't know what NPM is? I'm going to be really surprised. They're probably like held hostage somewhere and somehow this ended up on a loop and they couldn't skip this episode. But let's just for the sake of assuming that somebody's curious or somebody that works here that isn't a developer is curious, what is NPM and what are NPM packages?
So since you want it to be described for someone who's not a developer, let's just say that it's like the App Store, but for JavaScript modules for developers. It's a zip of JavaScript files that you can then, as a developer, import into your application and use, and you can express in a configuration file your dependencies on what those packages are and what their versions are. And in theory, everything is perfect and wonderful. The end, right?
And never has there ever been a problem with any sort of package delivered by NPM. All right, so this
Podcast
all
over.
yeah, and so this all started when actually Matt DiVertola and I were looking at some interesting NPM packages. So I did ask everybody to bring with them some of the more ridiculous NPM packages that were out there. So Matt, why don't you kick us off with your favorite kind of meme-worthy, ridiculous NPM package that you found?
All right. Yes. So I have one that's ridiculously meme worthy. Another one that's like, actually, I don't know how this is so popular. um, the first one is literally just called none. And the whole description of it is simple, elegant, flexible, nothing. And it is a single file that just declares one function called none that does absolutely nothing. Um, and that pulls in like 300 weekly downloads. A single version created several years ago, never touched ever since, still getting downloads.
I mean, how much changes about nothing, right? I mean, I physicists don't come at me, but nothing
Well,
is a reasonably static concept in software engineering. Sorry, Jeff, what were you going to say?
yeah, if I can just, jump in with a dumb one of mine. There's not much to talk about. This one is just called true. You can guess at what it does, but my main question to that point is why are there multiple versions of that?
We live in a post-truth world, Jeff. They are accounting for the news
I mean,
media and things that have changed with time. True can mean multiple. Is there a version of true that is
well,
false?
I there could be. I have to check. Actually, I should look at the diffs. I didn't do my homework on this one, and of course, as JavaScript developers that might be listening know very well, truthy and falsy are things. Perhaps, perhaps, there was a little wiggle room in the truthy and falsy responses from that
I
pack.
feel like none is more useful than true or false, right? Because at least with none, if it defines a function that does nothing, then you can pass that around and you can say, add listener none, right? If you really want to. I don't
hmm
know why you would add one to do nothing. Just don't add one at all. But, you know,
And now, like, it's getting a little Nietzsche. Like, we're getting into some 20th century philosophy, and
yeah.
You
yes,
can always expect a philosophical discussion of JavaScript here on This Is Fine. So, Matt, I'm really curious about which one you were referring to that had so many downloads. I kind of need to know what that is now.
Yeah, yeah. And I honestly think this kind of opens up like probably bigger question around like maybe some of the issues with NPM, but it's just called debug. And it essentially just creates a function, debug, that you can put logs into. Like JavaScript also has console.debug and like first party support for debug level logging. But this thing pulls, I kid you not, see 2 million weekly downloads. Like, and now I assume for some, like, this might be for, like, some older versions of Node, or, like, if, like, console.debug was introduced in some later version of JavaScript or something, like, that's the only thing that would ever make sense to me as this is getting installed on, like, a bunch of super old legacy projects. But
I
I don't know,
cannot
62
imagine that
million.
and I just say this because I've been using JavaScript since fucking Netscape Communicator, and it had console.log in it. And that was well before Node adopted what, and I don't know for sure. I haven't looked into this. This is just shooting from the hip, but the ECMAScript version that Netscape Communicator 11, to be fair, maybe Node forked from 10, I guess. But console.log was there in 1999 when Netscape Communicator 11 was still the predominant browser. So I appreciate, Matt, how you tried to see the better half of the world or of 62 million downloaded apps, but I don't think, I think it's always been there.
I mean, really, we could probably just say all of the micro libraries for the most part.
62 million people that don't know how to use console.
I mean, like,
Well,
to
heck,
to put that into perspective, like, React gets 6 million. So this
yeah.
gets 10 times. Like, this is, I think, the top, like, 2 or 3 node module is debug, and is probably useless for, like, most modern projects.
Well, so since we're a cybersecurity company, let's shift to another aspect of this, right? Or not that we are a cybersecurity company, but that's one of the big things that we do. Uh, so I think one of the reasons why these libraries get so many downloads is that they've been included as a dependency in something else, and then the whole transitive dependency system does its thing, right? And you as a developer, maybe you wouldn't depend on one of these micro libraries, but perhaps somewhere in your tree of dependencies, somebody did. And then that kind of snowballs and magnifies, which is why React has 6 million, but this thing has 60 million. So then we get to the other part of this, which is these things don't need to be touched. Maintainership is murky. Here's the cybersecurity part, right? And one of the flaws of NPM is that the packages execute when you depend on them, unlike other package managers where it's like an inert bundle, right? So just the act of depending on it and saying, update my project, boom, you have arbitrary code executing. And this has surprised people in the past, like when the Ukraine war started and they updated a version of one of their dependencies and a pro-Ukraine message got printed out to their console as they updated their dependencies. And we're not making a statement about whether the war is good or bad. We're just stating that this happened. And this, people wondered, like, all I did was update my dependencies, and yet code is executing on my machine, which has led to typo squatting of NPM packages with Bitcoin miners and other things like that. And when so many people rely on the package called debug and it doesn't really do anything, it doesn't need to do anything. If I'm the CIA or the FSB or Mossad or any of these, I'm trying to see if I can compromise the credentials of whoever uploaded that package personally. My opinion.
Yeah, super hard agree on all of that for sure. I will say, I think I might be popping the bubble on this one, Matt D, because I had never heard of it, but I'm looking at it. It is interesting. So what it's doing is it's allowing you to control whether or not that statement gets logged via an environment variable. So actually this gets into, people, even non-technical people have heard of log4j, and they know all the bad things related to that. But one of the things that exposes is this idea that, having or one of the solutions to log4j is moving to this other library that kind of exposes just an interface to say, like, aspirationally, I would like something logged. How it happens, I don't know. That's some other library's problem. So now your code is not dependent directly on how that thing gets written, or say if the library in question, like log4j, is going to allow remote code execution.
That's fair.
So when the problem with console.log is just the fact that there's
Yeah.
no control directly.
Okay. So we'll just go back to none and true and false.
Yeah.
As
Well,
our
if it's
examples, right?
gross, we'll take out
Is
debug.
even,
Sorry.
is odd,
Yeah.
all those wonderful ones.
But Greg's point on intelligence agencies seeking to insert themselves into the binaries or
Yeah.
in any of the artifacts of these packages, and the need for supply chain protection and so forth,
Yeah.
that still stands. Particularly, I mean, it even introduces this concept of like, well, it's unfortunate that you even need something like this because it's so basic, and that now you have to rely on a third party for this capability as opposed to, maybe directly from the quote vendor of the language, if a vendor even exists.
Well, I think one thing that we talked about is I think one of the reasons these micro libraries came about was because going way back into the early days of Node, when there was not really a good way to do usage analysis and packaging of your JavaScript app. So you didn't want to depend on these huge bundles, pull them in, and force them to be downloaded and parsed every single, or I mean, in Node, on the server side, it's not being downloaded, but you didn't want to force parsing of useless JavaScript that was never executed. So I think there was maybe some good theory behind it, but if only the language ecosystem had something like that built into it and didn't require the development community to come up with it, and then that wormed its way through the development ecosystem as well. And I think a lot of people who are in the Node JavaScript world really complain when people like us complain about micro packages because you don't have to do that anymore, and they probably also prefer not to use them.
I guess as we well, first off, you did call out some of the other micro packages like is even. The one that started this whole topic was is even AI, which uses OpenAI's ChatGPT-4 to determine if something is even, and nothing like using I think, Greg, I think you were the one that responded to this. Nothing like using a nuclear reactor to determine a mathematical function with
Yeah.
80% accuracy. Um, but but and now we should just move it to DeepSeek. That would just be the proper solution to using AI to determine if something is even with less
No,
of a
no,
waste.
no, no, Matt. Here's the move. We come out with Hunter Strategy AI. We produce the is even AI HS variant. And what we do is behind the scenes, we do the is even check modulo 2 equals 0, right? But then what we do is we do a probabilistic mapping on that. And 86% of the time we reverse the result. Or sorry, no, sorry. 14% of the time we reverse whatever the result is. And then what we do is we measure the energy that we consume and then claim that our AI version is using, 99.9% less energy than our competitor.
You figured it out. You've cracked the code.
Oh
And we
my god.
go into our SEC filing and say that, we only spent $3 developing it.
Um, just make sure no VCs are listening. So when we pitch this later,
No, this idea has
Yeah.
legs, Jeff. I'm thinking 99% savings in
okay,
We've created deterministic AI, Jeff. It's
Right.
deterministic
okay,
AI.
all right. I'll get a slide deck ready.
This is like,
My
do you
god.
guys remember when blockchain and Bitcoin were the buzzwords du jour, that there were a ton of companies that maybe they started as a blockchain product, but by the time they actually got it to market, they had taken all the blockchain stuff out, but they were still marketing it that way?
That's great.
Well, that's what we definitely need is to put more logic of blockchain related languages through these node micro packages. I think that that's really what the amalgamation of the world's technologies
There's
needed.
probably a lot of that in there by accident or on purpose, but
Definitely
by
is.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's so much. It's such an interesting problem to me because as like the worst developer on this call, like far and away, right? Like when NPM came out, it was like, oh, this is great. This is just like all I need to do is care about the demo that I'm building, the end user functionality. I don't need to know how any of this shit works. And I can build pretty useful things, right? Like I don't even think that's I think the positive of it. And it wasn't until LeftPad happened that I think that like anyone really started thinking. I mean, like certainly many people that understood like Maven or Gradle or like understood like how package management was done before this kind of like idiosyncratic approach. There was I think that there were people that knew, but my response to those people would have been, shut up, old fuddy-duddies, I'm writing code, right?
Yeah.
Like there was really no like broad concern about it. And then leftpad happened, and then everyone, first off, there was a lot of people that are on the more senior developer range, or ex developers, right? People that have gone into management and executive positions or gotten into other things that were like, wait, you had a shared library to pad text from the left? Help me understand again how this happened. And then the best part of it was, not the best part, I think that's the best part, but the most interesting part of it was the whole reason why the creator yanked control, or yanked it down from the repository, was because they didn't agree about how NPM was permissively claiming IP rights over things that was in there. And it's like, what an interesting and utterly useless library to be the canary in the coal mine for this supply chain problem, when in reality, fame and the utility of it would have if you were to create like a GitHub repository of the equivalent of leftpad and made people Google and find it and download it, it would never have
No.
been used,
Yep.
right? Like, I mean, not never, but basically never. Like, it wouldn't have had the ability to crash the internet because everybody did a Git pull and brought in the like new updated fuckery leftpad. It was just like a complaint against the system that very much was what made it like ubiquitous, which is, I don't know. I just feel like that irony hasn't really been discussed in any form that I've seen before.
Well, it is a cultural thing. So in the early days of Node.js, um, and again, if you are in the Node community and you write JavaScript backends, I probably am not talking about you. This is the early days when Node.js was brand new. Uh, the people who adopted it the most were my friends who were working in front end and maybe weren't very good engineers, because they just kind of bashed. Shouldn't say that. Like front end engineering is tough too, but front end always back in the day
Especially when
when Node was
Node.js came out
yeah,
and
when
like
Node.js
cross-browser
came out,
compatibility was like Hive was not great for
yeah.
my for
I just mean in that era, we tended to push the junior engineers and kind of the less skilled engineers into front end and reserve the better people for back end work. Maybe that's still happening today in your company, but that was the truth back then. And these people were basically saying, "Hey, now I can write the back end for my front end and I could do all my side projects because I already know JavaScript." And that was sort of the audience for Node. And I think a lot of those engineers were the early influence on packages and how things got done and what became popular. No
Yeah,
offense to you guys.
absolutely. I mean, like, I think of it as that side is like experimental and playful.
Right.
I remember,
The left-handed people.
right, exactly. When somebody first, explained to me what Node was, this JavaScript, and it just runs directly in, on your server. You can run JavaScript, and this is like 2008 or something,
Right.
and it's this radical thing, and it was like, I really, as somebody who sort of thinks of themselves as literally was a Java developer at the time, that just struck me as like, as fundamentally unserious, cool, really cool, but fundamentally unserious.
Right.
On the Java side, we don't play around. We've got everything's very structured and rigid and
Yep.
stodgier and everything. The
We
we
have threads.
we were happy to pay, hundreds of thousands of dollars for WebLogic licenses and the sort of the big deployment
Speak
model.
for yourself there, buddy.
I know. We of the people making the business decisions that we then executed.
The non-technical people were happy to pay for things the
Yeah,
developers said you shouldn't buy. Yeah, that's for sure.
exactly. So that's the execution context versus just like, oh, we got this cool Node thing, and like I just slapped together some JavaScript, and put it into this open source thing, and it just runs, and like, yeah, it
Yeah.
just broke a lot of people's brains, I think.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's definitely true about what was being pushed to kind of more junior developers at the time, because I was one of them, right? I was a UI developer. I came from that world, and I was a true today. I feel like UI developers have some design skill sets, have some, customer experience. Like there's a whole other aspect of thinking to really be a UX developer in today's world. I had none of that. I couldn't make a pretty thing. I couldn't, I needed a separate designer to tell me how much padding to put on my forums because that is not a thing I could infer, right?
Yep.
But for developers like me that just wanted to hit refresh and wanted to brute force the thing that they were working on, that's what browsers kind of demanded, right? They were these
Yep.
big black boxes. They changed all the time. They did not behave consistently. So to somebody who was learning software engineering through experimentation, it made a lot of sense to give it to that kind of person.
Yep.
And I agree that that was what kind of created this audience, and Node kind of really did fill an interesting gap at the time, because even things like when Express came out and Express, this whole routing concept in Node, I remember at the time being like, this breaks my brain. Like, why do I need to understand these abstract concepts? Like, I will just log in and log out, and those will be functions, and people will click them. And I
Yep.
don't need contexts, and I don't need to think about that. And it took me a while to even appreciate the value. Actually, I never appreciated the value. I got into security and other things instead because I just couldn't get my head around that. But it did kind of create this, for a while, cultural divide between the full stack JavaScript kind of approach that I would say a lot of design shops and a lot of design studios, people that were creating applications that were inherently not for enterprise use. The example I'll give is like NBC's Olympics app, right? Which like had been coming out for 15, 20 years now. That was one of the first full Node JavaScript, and I think it was Ionic they used to package it because it wasn't a true native Objective-C app. I don't remember if that was the first or second, doesn't matter. But that was a great example because you needed it to work. It needed to be pretty. It needed to exist for between 1 and 6 months on somebody's phone. And like, why would you invest in a really expensive and cumbersome back end? Why would you go through all the hoops of all of like creating a native app in Objective-C when it's, and like streaming changed all that later, right? When you could actually watch it on your phone as opposed to just see the schedule and know who the athletes were. So different expected functionality certainly changed that with time. But that's why these design shops did it, because creating these ephemeral apps that just kind of existed for a little bit and kind of served a temporary business purpose was very different than when I think it was United was one of the first people to create like mobile check-in, right? Like that
Yeah.
became like a core part of their business, and they had a vision. It might have been Delta, it doesn't matter. Airline came up with this, and that airline realized like, I can pay less people at the gates. I can pay less people at the ticket counters. Like I can automate a lot of my workforce, and that part of my app is core to my business. And JetBlue, who I still mock to this day, because even though I'm a big fan of the service and it goes where I need it to go, their app is garbage, and it's built like the early Olympics app with some type of weird wrapper, and they haven't invested in it as core to their business because I just think that their digital practice was a lot more outsourced, a lot done to these design shops as opposed to
Yep.
United. And I know a lot of people that work there that like, everybody that works on the United app is a United employee. They don't contract that out the way NBC gives out the Olympics app every year to some other design company, or usually the same, probably. I would imagine they keep it in the same shop. So there's just this interesting divide that it allowed, which I think fit a niche in the market that was actually very important for
Oh,
commerce,
yeah.
but definitely changed like, what did it mean to be an enterprise app? What did it mean to be an internet scale core to your business app? And what did it mean to be this more ephemeral, like temporary app that is, maybe to drum up business, or maybe to create awareness, or to like coordinate logistics at a conference, or something a little bit less core to the business.
And it's funny you mentioned that because I think you're kind of striking at the heart of it. Personally for me, The first person in my orbit to adopt Node.js was a friend of mine who worked for an advertising company who do designs, and he basically mostly did throwaway one-off JavaScript interactive advertisements online, and he could never write a backend, and he usually asked me to help him write backends for personal projects, and we would do them in different languages, usually PHP. And when Node came out, he no longer asked me for help doing backends.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, so and to the similar point you made earlier, but about today, a couple observations there. We had one of our new teams that we stood up. We did training for the tech stack, both the quote front end and back end. But so many concepts for both of those separate. Those are specific trainings on the Spring framework on the front end and Spring Boot, and then Angular. Sorry, I had a Spring on the back end, Angular on the front end. But like, the concept of inversion of control, and I'm not going to like bore people with defining these technical concepts, but they're sharing the same stuff. So like, if you're a front end developer working on those things, you have to know it. It works basically the same. You're sort of injecting dependencies into your components in Angular, and more or less, different mechanisms to do it. But you have to, as an individual, like, what do I need to know? Well, you kind of have, if you can't get away from those maybe more rigorous structured engineering approaches, and maybe, I guess, juxtaposing that to sort of like the early days of like, oh, I can build a REST API in Express, and I just do this, and it's like it's in one file, and like, sure, but also like when you want to expand and expand on it, it does necessarily, you have to start standing on the shoulders of giants and learn more things. It's just part of it. And one other observation too, there's something about, and I've seen this with teams as well, that the whole divide, I guess, between like somebody who considers themselves a front end developer and maybe like Greg's friend he was talking about. So the mean stack was very popular in the early days, right? And I think those people are super comfortable with Mongo because like it's storing the data in the exact same format that they were dealing with. In the early, early Mongo, you didn't even have to set up users. You just typed Mongo, and the thing was there, and you just go in and do stuff. And this idea of like, oh, you need a username and password. I don't really know how to do that. That.
Boring.
Yeah, when we go to production, we'll figure that out later. That was sort of the attitude for a long time, but I think they feel safe for people and I've seen this this year with some teams where I had to really pull people out of their comfort zone to be like, this is a relational database, and this is SQL. This is it's not going to bite.
Yeah.
I don't think it's not that they can't do it. It's just it feels that I think people are so accustomed to sticking where they feel safe, and they go, well, I don't really need that. Like my last project used Mongo, and like, I don't know, this is what I know. They can learn it, but like there's something about it that just is like, feels like this dangerous leap from one building to another, and they're like, I don't want to do it, unless somebody really pushes me.
I
Well,
think also like,
no,
sorry,
no, go ahead.
go
No,
ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was gonna say from a perspective that's has really no idea what was going on in the early like Node days. Like I think there's
Sure,
a
just dunk on us
big
indirectly. That's great.
sorry,
You could
sorry,
tell
but
by the
like I
mustache he was not he was not alive then.
Speaking is not an old.
No, our generation, nobody had mustaches. Anyway, go ahead.
no did not intend to dunk on anybody, but
No, that's okay.
I think there is a big draw. Like if you look at Node today, like it's absolutely grown up, and like a lot of these things that you're talking about, like with the new like server side rendered frameworks, like the Next.js's and the Nuxt.js's and everything like that.
Agreed.
Like there's really that line of what is front end and back end is kind of gone, and it absolutely has fallen towards JavaScript. So like if you're a young dev today and you're like, oh, I want to build this app, then you're going to go and you're going to install React and Next, and you're going to probably go deploy it to Vercel, which is this whole other thing of, huge cloud provider that's now being built on the back of an NPM module, which is kind of cool. But like, I think that whole kind of like paradigm is a weird thing that's happening where I don't know if there's like Node's gotten really big to a point where I don't think it's ever going to go anywhere. And I also think it's like fundamentally just going to be where things keep going. And like, I don't know, I don't want to go as far as saying there's not really much of a use to learn much others, but if you're just interested in building apps of like database read writes and everything like that, then I don't really know if most people need to learn something else.
Actually, that is a perfect segue because what I was going to say after Jeff ties in with what you said too. And it's basically one of the things that the whole JavaScript front end and back end tapped into was the sheer utility of having your front end and back end in the same language. That is huge. Many projects have tried that. If you remember GWT back in the day, which was like transpile Java to JavaScript and HTML. These
Matt, just to
days,
be clear, Matt does not remember that.
Yeah.
okay,
But it
it
was,
still exists.
but by the
Yeah.
way, Matt, just for concept, it went the other way, and it was to create your UI in Java, and
Yep.
GWT transposed it to HTML, and you could do it all in one language.
Yep.
And if you were a super Java heavy developer, it was great, right? It did all kinds of neat things. If you were somebody like me that kind of like sucked at Java, but like could make myself useful to Java developers by doing JavaScript on their behalf because they didn't want to learn it. It was so fucking cumbersome and it was
Yeah.
terrible. Like I
Well,
hated when I had to work in GWT. Sorry, Greg, I didn't mean
no,
to
that's
interrupt.
fine. And but let's just be real though. I mean, it was a powerful framework. I don't know about now, but there was a long time when all of the G Suite was written in it.
Yep.
So
Oh,
you have probably inadvertently used a GWT application if you've ever
oh.
touched a Google service. At least maybe before recent Material UI refreshes. But I don't know, maybe it's still in GWT. Don't know anymore. But let's forget that because that's my example of one of the early bad ones.
It's still valid. Last release November 24.
I told you it still exists. But here,
I didn't believe you. I had to look it up.
what I want to move on to actually are stacks that you can learn as a developer that give you a way more powerful, better backend than what JavaScript provides you, but also give you that single framework UI. And the ones that I would highlight for you are Phoenix Live View, which is Elixir, fantastic language, beautiful platform. I'm really looking for an opportunity to use that somehow. I don't know about federal government use, but we can dream. Then there's things like Laravel and Livewire, which do something similar, and it lets you write your PHP backend, gives you a component UI. There's Blazor in the C# world, which again, these things that you can even write. Well, okay, so not in Blazor, but some of them let you write JSX web components, use them in the backend, and it'll even do all the interactive WebSocket, live update communication, kind of like React server components. Really cool stuff. And there's one in Java called Vadenflow. And there's probably a couple others, but these things are out there and you can have a really powerful backend and you choose something like C# with Blazor to write your backend UI. It allows you to then later pull your UI off, scale that separately, pull your backend out, and then put APIs on top. It gives you the ability to start with the ease of programming like a monolithic backend like we used to back in the day, but you can break that into microservices really easily. And you don't have to start with JavaScript anymore. Please, kids, you don't have to start with JavaScript.
So since and I appreciate that, but since the topic was Node and we talked about Node growing up a little bit. No, because I think it's
Yeah,
valid because I think it's a good point that the world really shifted in that direction. I think because so many people getting into programming were kind of pushed to these JavaScript things, and then JavaScript started to be able to do other things. I mean, we kind
yeah,
of, I mean, we've seen this, we've talked through this iterative history, and that is why I think it's so prevalent today and why Matt's point is valid that like there's
it
a
is.
lot of
Yeah,
people that are going to build incredibly scalable, interesting applications that never know any other language, don't even really understand patterns, don't understand a lot of things that as a computer scientist you really should know. As a software engineer, however, you don't necessarily need to know. And that's like kind of this distinction that was for a while a distinction without a difference. But I think as tooling has grown, being a software engineer is kind of like the MIS difference that people used to get when they wouldn't want to get a comp sci degree. They were learning more like Office Suite, maybe like today it's like a little more Python and R and some other type of business languages. And I think that there are some places that are coming out with software engineering degrees that really avoid like teaching you how to re-implement a linked list in Java or C++, right? Things that like are super important if you're going to want to be a computer scientist, but are not in any way required if your goal in life is to be a web developer. Right. And I think that it's great to point out that there are languages that let you be a web developer that aren't JavaScript that have other utilities as well. I think that's kind of cool. But on the NPM side, I'm curious, let's talk about how to, because we've dunked on NPM a lot, and I think that it's important that we talk about there are ways to do it that are more safe, more secure, and mitigate a lot of the risks that we've talked about. And I'd like to spend the last couple minutes talking through those. So, Jeff, do you want to give some thoughts on that?
Well, first, I was just in defense of maybe just to compare it to Java. And again, I say this as somebody who still loves Java today. If you think about what do you,
Boo. Sorry.
well, you're at least, you're maybe outnumbered on this call to some extent if Greg's gonna, come with me there. But so what do you get, right? You get a runtime, you get a package manager and a registry, you get built-in audit functionality for dependency analysis. I'm probably missing some other major things, but if I compare that to the Java side, well, you gotta run, assuming that when I say runtime, maybe I mean how do you run your web application, assuming it's a web application? Well, you need Tomcat or Jetty for that. Then you need Maven or Gradle or Artifactory or Nexus, or, store your artifacts. You need to use some kind of external SaaS tool. So there's a whole sort of ecosystem of additional things that you'd have to depend on there. So, start off in a pretty good place. So that's you know, I don't, as far as like, well, what do you do? Like, how do we make decisions around using libraries? I don't think there's a silver bullet here. One thing is like, I certainly care about how widely used the module is. I think there's a tendency I mean, we've seen this so many places. Like, it's essentially the see no evil thing with vulnerabilities. Countless customers that are not thinking of the outcomes. They're really just thinking of the checklist and the process. So the tool that I was mandated to use by my organization, whether it's, or the Air Force or whatever, it did not find anything. Well, cool, but what if we've seen some very, programs that we've inherited, code bases we've inherited over the years using very questionable libraries, and not ones questionable in the sense of like, some spy agency is setting up a honeypot, trap, but just sort of like, why would anyone ever use this, thing out of a book that was written 20 years ago? Like, that's just, don't do that. So there's never going to be a CVE against that library, because nobody would ever even think to do that. So I mean, I guess if I'm asking, I'm writing my own question here, but I guess if the question is like, what's the process I go through? I think that's a one big thing is just like, let's please, if I'm talking to a team, somebody who's looking at a library, don't pull in something that has like 5 downloads. It doesn't need to have the 62 million downloads that our favorite debug package has, but somewhere in between 5 and 62 million. It doesn't have to be updated incredibly frequently. Obviously, if it's like totally dead, that's an issue. But if it's reasonably, it's still widely used and it's just sort of a commoditized thing that, hey, look, they're meeting this. They're giving you a bunch of utility, around a very niche thing. That's great. If they do a good job, because like, I don't want people on our teams to have to be writing methods like is valid email, or like, get file extension from a file name, or just these sort of things where it's like, all right, anyone can do that. Any good developer can obviously do those things, but they still have to spend the time to do it right and write, a set of unit tests that actually gets us to a good outcome to where we need to be. And it's just, so I think that's like getting back to the left pad question maybe is like, why would you ever use this? So obviously there's a million use cases to pull in. I use the term stand on the shoulders of giants. Like, for sure, other people solving these problems, you have to be kind of judicious about it.
So,
I
well,
mean,
let's go ahead, Matt.
well, I was going to say, I definitely agree with that. I feel like the people on big teams that should be making decisions on what packages are getting used should be your senior devs or your tech leads. And if you see an update to a package lock, you're paying a lot of attention to what's getting pulled into that. And really, in most cases, it's going to be maybe a dozen really high impact modules that you should be using rather than, importing is even for is even operations, but rather looking to something that is kind of, Jeff, like you were saying, something that might do several of those common operations like email validation or type
Yeah.
checking or whatever it is that you kind of group into one single module that is highly supported versus a huge fragmented package lock with a dozen of tiny little packages. So I think a lot of it is being intentful.
I was going to say, I would rather copy in a gist, let that be your guide. If it could fit in a gist, it shouldn't be a dependency.
So one question, and this is just speaking to kind of secure setups. I've heard from some people, I think you all know who I'm talking about, that you never want to pull directly from the NPM repo, the public one. You want to host your own mirror, just as an example of how to avoid supply chain attacks. Once you've, vetted the right package, had your dev leaves evolved, do all the things you guys have talked about. What are other setup conditions that you can think about other than hosting your own local mirror, looking for package signatures and comparing hashes? I mean, there's some things that have matured in the NPM space, kind of like Jeff mentioned, like in early Mongo days, there wasn't even a requirement to. I remember actually you doing a heck of a lot of work to bootstrap the concept of a password. So these things can take a little while. What are other things that can be done
Whenever
to
I had
make
to
that
use
possible?
whenever I have to work on a Node code base, I spin up a very unprivileged container that can't access anything on my computer, and I do the npm updates in there. Maybe I'm just one of those crazy guys, but just say no to arbitrary code execution.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything crazy about that. Um, I mean, one of the things we haven't even talked about is NPM as a means to also rolling out executable all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Which is it's super useful. I mean, one of my really dumb examples was so I don't know if this counts as the at the remit of this podcast episode, but I pulled in one that's just called the fuck, which I basically if you type like you know gut instead of gut branch instead of get branch, you can just once you've installed the fuck, you just type fuck and it will repeat the last command. It will fix it. So then you type fuck and it just says get branch and then
You know,
you get the outcome you wanted.
well, I guess for all the 9-year-old developers that watch this podcast, plug your ears.
Yeah, it's funny because I was like, "Hey, can I even announce this thing on this podcast?" But Matt broke the ice, so I just said, "Okay, well, I don't, either that or
Yeah.
we're gonna have to do a lot of editing to this one, so we'll see."
The thing that bugs me, and I don't know a good remediation for it, is any package manager that doesn't use namespace packages, they're more susceptible to name squatting and typo squatting. And if you're not in the security community and you don't know what that stuff is, typo squatting is when you transpose some letters in a common way to get people who have made typos to install your malicious package. And name squatting is when it can be a couple things. Sometimes that's when you imagine a name of an actually legitimately useful package and then you create your malicious package and upload it to that name. But it can also be creating something that sounds official, but is not. Like, for example, there was a malicious VS Code Python extension that had an official sounding name. It looked like it was okay, but it was actually not the right one to install. And there were a lot of installs of it. And same thing with there was a dark theme in VS Code that was equally malicious. And one could argue if it was a typo squat or a name squat, but I think it was either Dracula or Darkula. But basically, there was a famous IntelliJ dark theme of a certain name. And then somebody created like a similar or same named dark theme malicious package for VS Code. And those were both very successful packages.
Hmm.
So those sorts of things keep me up at night because if it has a name that sounds right, looks right, smells right, if you're not really into it and aware and you approve that PR and every developer on your team updates and pulls a malicious package and who knows what happens at that point. And developer compromise is a real problem because you could have .env files with API keys and all kinds of stuff on your workstation that a normal user wouldn't have. And it's a very big deal for a developer to get compromised. And I like the ability to use my workstations. I don't want the security people telling me that as a developer, I need to have a more locked down workstation, not a less locked down workstation.
And
So,
I think this is a totally separate episode, but you kicked off a conversation about sort of early about DevSecOps pipelines and how that PR approval is sort of in some cases is the only line of defense that we have. We
yeah,
have fully automated deployments behind it, so that's sort of maybe unintended side effect,
yeah.
but that might be an interesting thing to delve more into later.
That doesn't even get into your build servers might be specially privileged to go deploy to your production environment, and you make a little mistake there, and oh boy.
Well, even though we started in a fun place, I hope we gave some interesting tips and insights to people that are using NPM. I really appreciate Matt bringing us a perspective that reminds me how old we are, especially in this world of software engineering, which moves a lot faster than everything else in my life, which is also going very fast. And I want to thank everybody for listening today. I do think that there would be a real fun follow-up episode we could do on alternative, a kind of native modern single language frameworks. So I think that'd be really fun. We gotta
Yeah.
gotta take that one down for next time. But for now, thank you everyone. It's been another great episode of This Is Fine, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
All right,
Thanks,
thanks.
everyone.